Hello, and welcome to the podcast. I'm your host for all things British and American, by the name of Carl. Today, we will talk about Maryland, specifically the colony of Maryland. Why Maryland? Why, because Maryland is an excellent example of one of the most interesting periods in British history. Specifically, you can see in the history of the colony of Maryland a reflection of all of the strife caused in Britain during the English Civil Wars of the 17th century. As usual, though, our story starts long before the 17th century, long before Maryland was even a glimmer in the eye of Lord Baltimore. As usual with so many things in British history, it was all King Henry VIII's fault. When King Henry made Britain into a Protestant nation, he forced the Catholics to become an underclass. Catholics were no longer trusted by the English government and were ostracized by British society. The backlash to this would come in no lesser form than Bloody Mary, which, of course, would restore Catholics to power and then herself, Queen Mary, be overthrown. Because the British didn't really like Catholics anymore, and they did not like the fact that Bloody Mary persecuted Protestants in favor of the Catholics. So Queen Elizabeth I takes over, and she doesn't have any heirs. She is the Virgin Queen. What does that mean? Well, it means that the monarchy had to go to someone else. And that someone else turned out to be James Stuart. James VI of the Royal House Stuart of Scotland came to the throne after the death of Queen Elizabeth I and became monarch of the three kingdoms, Ireland, Scotland, and England. Well, King James I was a Protestant, but he wasn't very good at it. His wife was a Catholic, and he doted upon his wife. Wait a second, I'm thinking of Charles the First. Fuck. Okay, we'll need to cut that out. King James I would eventually die, and his son, King Charles I, would take over. King Charles I wore out his welcome very quickly. For one thing, although he was Protestant, allegedly, his wife was Catholic, and he tended to support the Catholics around Britain. This did not sit well with the British populace. In fact, they chafed under King Charles I's rule. And King Charles I, showing absolutist tendencies, really made the Protestants mad. And he also trampled all over the rights of Parliament. Well, all of this combined made King Charles I unable to remain on the throne in the eyes of many a British citizen. They charged Parliament with dethroning King Charles I, and so Parliament did. Parliament dethroned King Charles I and instituted the rule of Parliament in the English Civil Wars. However, we need to back up a bit, because King Charles I is actually where the story of Maryland begins. You see, King Charles I handed the Charter of Maryland to to the first Lord Baltimore, George Calvert. Now, George Calvert, the Lord Baltimore, was a Catholic. Remember that thing that I said about King Charles I supporting Catholics a lot? Well, he supported this Catholic. He supported George Calvert. Now, because he supported George Calvert, he decided to give George Calvert a colony. And so George Calvert, the first Lord Baltimore, went over and explored the New World in the hopes of finding a suitable place to put down a colony. At first he tried Newfoundland. That didn't work out. And then he went down south, just north of the very profitable Virginia colony, and he decided to set up his colony of Maryland, named so for King Charles I's wife, Mary, who was Catholic. He decided to set up his colony of Maryland there, where the state of Maryland resides today. Anyway, he died before he could see it happen, which meant that he left it to his son, the second Lord Baltimore, Cecil Calvert. Now, he was Catholic like his father, and he did not like the fact that Catholics weren't treated so well in England. So, when he received the charter from his father, well, in the event that his father died, he decided that he would set up, essentially, a Catholic colony in the New World. A haven for the Catholics of the British Isles, who were chafing under the oppression of the Protestant English society. Of course, he couldn't simply set up the colony just for Catholics. That would not be proper, especially considering that Britain was technically supposed to be a Protestant nation. So instead, he decided to lure colonists with the promise of religious toleration. And he would be largely successful. Unfortunately for the Lord Baltimore, he would attract a lot of Protestants. Amongst these Protestants, he attracted a lot of Puritans. And these Puritans sort of chafed under both British rule and then Virginian rule. Basically, they chafed under any rule that was not their own. So, from Virginia, Puritans began moving north into Maryland, and they set up their own city, the city of Providence, which would eventually become the city of Annapolis, which is the capital of Maryland today. But, back to Lord Baltimore. Lord Baltimore saw the writing on the wall. He knew that the Protestants were becoming quite the large majority in the colony of Maryland, and he was afraid for the rights of his Catholics. So, in an effort to protect the Catholics, but still extend that promise of religious toleration to the Protestants, he decided that his colony needed to enshrine in law religious toleration. And so the Act of Religious Toleration was born in 1649. He couldn't have picked a more fortuitous time, because back in Britain, they were in the midst of a civil war. You see, King Charles I had angered England so much that parliamentary forces raised armies and deposed him. He was trying to regain his throne, and in order to do so, he was relying heavily on support from the Catholics. This did not sit well at all with the English populace, and support for the parliamentary faction grew. Eventually, Parliament triumphed. Eventually, the Puritans in Britain, specifically, triumphed. The General Oliver Cromwell wound up with all the power at his fingertips. After deposing the Stuart monarchs, he had control of the army, which was really the only force now keeping Britain together. And because of this, it meant that Oliver Cromwell had all of the power. So, what did he do but institute Puritanism as the law of the land? Now, this very much emboldened the Puritan citizens of Maryland, which in 1654 decided to overthrow the Lord Baltimore. They did not want to be ruled by a Catholic any longer. So, they overthrow the Lord Baltimore and get rid of religious toleration. They were now a Puritan state in the New World, and they were not holding with any of that religious toleration that had been extended to them by the Lord Baltimore. They thought it silly. Well, eventually, Lord Baltimore regained control of Maryland in 1660, when the Puritans were finally deposed with the restoration of Charles II. Charles II, son of Charles I, was restored, hence the name Restoration, to the English throne, and with him came more toleration for Catholics once again. So, he reinstituted Lord Baltimore, Cecil Calvert, as the proprietor of the colony of Maryland, and the Act of Religious Toleration was once again put into place. In fact, religious toleration became the law of the land in Britain as well. People were tired of fighting after all of the civil wars that they had gone through, and they decided that it would just be better for everyone if they could just calm down and allow people, Christians, only Christians, no heathens, but they decided that a policy of toleration for all Christians would be the law of the land, and hopefully that would bring more peace. It lasted for a little while. In 1688, James II, brother of King Charles II, came to the throne after King Charles II died, and he didn't do well. He was very Catholic, And he started to walk back the policy of religious toleration in favor of making England more Catholic. This did not sit well at all with the populace of Britain, and they decided once again to rebel. They called upon the Protestant William of Orange and his wife Mary, which would become Queen Mary II. And, of course, Queen Mary was the real heir. But William was able to become a joint ruler in his own right, with the support of Mary. The important thing is, in 1689, after they took the throne in what is called the Glorious Revolution, so-called because there was no civil war in England that put King William and Queen Mary on the throne, they simply came over with an army and James II left. He was quite cowardly, to be very honest with you. But, so he left, and now that the Protestants were firmly back in charge, the Protestants in Maryland grew bold again and threw out the Lord Baltimore. Again. And only in 1715, with the third Lord Baltimore, who would become a Protestant, was Maryland restored to the family of Baltimore. Now, the story of Maryland's religious strife is a great reflector of the strife happening in Britain. You will notice that every upheaval that happened in Maryland happened because of the upheaval in Britain. And so this is a great measure for how religious toleration became accepted in both Britain and the New World. Thank you guys for listening to the podcast. Remember, my name is Carl Rapp, and this is me, Pip Pip Cheerio, signing off.